We're here with Minister of Communications and Digital Technologies, Solly Malatsi. It is such a pleasure to welcome you to the Broad Media Studios, and for agreeing to an interview. It's a first for a Ministry of Communications for us, so I really appreciate it. And I'm gonna get right into it. One of the big issues that's come up from the ISP industry is a lack of access to specific licenses, to network and service licenses, but one specific license that requires ministerial intervention is the IECNS license. Is that something that the ministry is looking at, to issue a ministerial directive to say ICASA can hold an invitation to apply for these kinds of licenses?
First of all, thanks for the opportunity. Apologies, it took too long to get in here. As you can imagine, trying to adapt and get used into this new position has been a bit of a high car speed chase. But finally, we are here. Look, I think particularly with that is to recognize that, you know, while there are things that the minister can do, ICASA by legislation has to be independent, you know, as a regulator. But the market dictates that there is a need for movement around that issue. So I would not want to be middling with what ICASA should be doing. But my view is that we find ourselves in a very unique environment with the Government of National Unity, right? And one of the priorities of the Government of National Unity is pursuing inclusive economic growth and job creation. And one of the ways of doing that is looking at where regulation and policy are obstacles to achieving those two goals. And the president has been very, very adamant throughout every opportunity he has with ministers to say that be creative, think out of the box, relook at where the regulatory and policy obstacles are, and let's remove them so that we can attract new investment. And the ITC sector is a major contributor to the economy of our country. And I think that's a conversation that ultimately even ICASA cannot avoid. I'm currently doing a series of engagements with all the entities under the department, and I'm sure that discussion will emerge when I meet with ICASA. And my approach is very simple, Hannes. I want every entity that I engage with to be in sync with what the vision of this administration is. But what I'm not going to do is to be canvassing their department and canvassing state-owned enterprises under my control in the media when I've got internal platforms and opportunities to engage with them, and most importantly, hold them account and provide the oversight that I'll do. But I think that question that you are asking around the licenses for the ISPs is that wherever there is an opportunity to unlock opportunities for investment, we need to be looking at those and saying this is an opportunity to pursue one of the core goals of this administration, which is inclusive economic growth.
So this is something that came up under your immediate predecessor, and the suggestion from the ISP Association of South Africa was that the minister, because for this specific license, it requires a ministerial proclamation. The other, so that's for being able to build network infrastructure. Service licenses, ICASA can do on its own, but the network licenses requires the minister to issue a policy directive. And so what they were suggesting is that the minister issue just a standing directive to say, you know, ICASA can issue invitations to apply for this, or there's a standing invitation to apply even. So anybody can at any time apply to ICASA for a license like this.
I'll be more keen in looking at, you know, the policy proposal and that suggestion in depth in order to make an in-depth, a very credible decision on it. But the principle remains. Wherever there is an opportunity to promote inclusive economic growth, to ensure that there is healthy market competition, and there is a fair regulatory environment, we're always going to be interested in those aspects. So I'll just have to get the details, and I hope you can share that suggestion in full with me, so that I can interrogate it and be able to satisfy myself with. I hadn't interacted with that suggestion up until this interview.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
And a hot button topic throughout the previous administration was the issue of Starlink.
Yeah.
And we have really just been joining the dots. There's been somebody happening to run across a Starlink person at a mining conference in Cape Town or something, and Starlink itself is not saying much. Have you heard anything from Starlink about the situation in South Africa and what might be keeping them out?
No, I haven't had anything from Starlink. My office hasn't been, contacted by Starlink, even if it is to do an introductory meetings. I have tried to establish with the department whether there's been any previous efforts on the part of Starlink to initiate, at the very least, a conversation with the department about how it could possibly enter the South African market. And so far, there is no record of an indication that Starlink has reached out to the department or vis-a-vis. But I think the important thing for me, particularly with this, is this administration is always going to be willing to engage and listen to anyone who could add value to our economy, who in this instance could ultimately add value towards the country's stated ambition of pursuing digital inclusion by bridging the digital divide. And I think in the next few weeks and in the next hopefully soon, we'll at least have an indication of how we can proceed on this very conversation. But the South African public, daily on Twitter, I get tagged into, bring Starlink here. Ultimately, you can only bring someone here who wants to come. Right, and someone can only want to come if they'll also be welcomed, right? So you gotta strike that balance. But I think we will be very proactive in saying where are the opportunities in the market that can help foster digital inclusion. That is one of my priorities, and that is my interest. And we'll look at every possible avenue within. And which is the most important part, within the confines of the law, while also being very adept at ensuring that regulation is not an inhibitor to opportunity, but rather it enhances it.
And part of that law, and this is related to it because this was part of the speculation about why Starlink wasn't coming to South Africa. But it's not just Starlink that's concerned about this. The local ISPs are, and especially small ISPs, are concerned about this new regulation, which IASA introduced at the end of March 2021 already, which was, right now as the law is written, it says that someone with these IEC and S licenses must be 30% owned by historically disadvantaged groups. IASA wants to change that, or at least it has legislation or regulation published right now that changes that to 30% black owned. But it's not enacted, that regulation, just kind of hanging there, and it's causing a lot of uncertainty in the industry. Is that something that you as minister can address?
Look, there's also cross-cutting regulation, the regulation that I also put in place by the Department of Trade and Industry in terms of the composition of ownership in doing business in South Africa. So I think this is a whole conversation about the demographic of ownership, and how do we, as we find ourselves in this new environment, look at policy in such a way that it opens up doors for possible investment. I can tell you for free now, in order for the South African fiscus to continue being able to provide for the social services that so many millions of South Africans are dependent on, we need to broaden, our tax collection basket and revenues, and you can only do that not by overtaxing private citizens, because there's very few and fewer of them. So you gotta be able to say, how do we attract businesses to get into the economy? Because I think arguably the biggest chunk of tax revenue comes from the business sector, and if we can attract more, it means that we will be able to attract more towards social services. But I think that, more succinctly to your point, we are going to be proactive in looking at how do we overcome regulatory interventions that suffocate the space for potential investments that can lead to job creation.
Then another issue that you've when you stepped into this ministry, inherited a bunch of projects that are in the middle of completion, which is a whole lot better than 10 years ago when none of them were doing anything. But still, it's a challenge. One of those is the Analogue switch off. Now, the current deadline for that switch off is 31 December. Is that still on the cards?
Look, I said in my budget speech that what we need is to do a very evidence-based assessment of our readiness for that deadline, right? Because there are two things to balance here. One is the fact that it's a long-standing deadline. The other is the reality that it has some very, very serious impact on the future of the broadcasters in this instance, and that could lead to having South Africans not being able to have access and being able to enjoy access to their TVs and broadcasting, because they are still on terrestrial if we make this move. And I've said that ultimately, in making a decision about whether to stick with that deadline or whether there's a postponement on the deadline, it must be informed by the evidence that what is in the best interest of the country at this stage. I am engaging with the broadcasters who will mostly be affected by this, both the SABC and E-Media. I've previously met the SABC of this. I've got an upcoming engagement with E-Media, who have already written a letter to this effect. And I think there are also other administrative household things that we as the department need to have fulfilled before we can be in a position to say, hey, yes, let's proceed with the deadline. The reality is there is a very genuine concern about the approximately 400,000 households that are still on terrestrial. And can we, in between this period and December, move the majority of those into digital? That is also a key consideration.
And is that data credible? Is it pretty much that's a fact that there are about 400,000 households?
Well, that's why I said in my consideration, I need to be able to have access to what is our state of readiness towards that date. And that will consider, even whether that number is credible, and also what is then the approach to getting that number, switching over, because that's the most important thing. But one thing, Hannes, that's very, very important here. When these deadlines are made and pronounced on, and there's agreement from industry players, there's also got to be an expression of good faith that when they come, because they express support for them, they must comply. So that we don't engage in things wherein we agree one time on things, and then a few months down the line we find other creative ways of filibustering the process. So those are the considerations that I'm faced with. But one thing that I will not do is to leave the pronouncement on that decision very, very late and very close to that deadline, because it just creates unhealthy and unnecessary anxiety in the sector.
Yes, and E-Media, in its recent results, or integrated report rather, it seemed to indicate that it was in favor of the analog signal being left until it dies on its own, you know, as people switch to streaming and stuff. Is that on the table, to just leave those remaining analog transmissions?
Look, I'll let eMedia, speak for themselves. I'm focused on what are the different considerations that are on my table, because while I have a duty to ensure that the switch over also happens, I also have another responsibility to ensure that we don't leave South Africans behind. And in addition to that, I have to consider that have we as a department and a government fulfilled our role in ensuring that, with the digital migration program that was meant for the installation of set-top boxes, for people to move over, that we have fulfilled our part, and that we have done so regardless of the challenges that we have faced, so that I am then in a comfortable position to say, in consideration of all of these factors, the deadline is still appropriate to proceed with or not. And if not, it is simply informed by reasons. But we can't have a situation wherein this is going to be an unanswered question in perpetuity. We can't have that, and I won't allow that.
Okay. And this all ties together, and it kind of there's a whole bunch of data points that leads me to a potential conclusion. So if you forgive me for a second before I ask the question. So we've got eMedia saying that there's this huge concern around losing viewers with the analog switch off, but they also had some of their digital transmitters switched off because they weren't paying for them. Then the SABC is talking about launching its own satellite TV service to compete with OpenView and perhaps DStv, also under the guise of losing viewership with the analog switch off. But we also know that both these broadcasters are unhappy about how much they're paying Centec for the terrestrial signal. Is all of this not just about how much they're paying Centec at the end of the day?
Well, it depends, how you look at it. And for me, it's important to not be distracted by the frills, and focus on the substance of the issue. With regards to analog switch off, the decision has to be informed by those three factors that I mentioned earlier. Most importantly, have we as the department and government done our part in terms of making sure that vulnerable South Africans who are supposed to help and empower, we have provided and installed these set-top boxes so that they can be able to enjoy access to TV beyond this date. And secondly, that there are no direct negative impacts on the sustainability of the broadcasters themselves. And that is where the broadcasters can speak for themselves. I'm not interested in the argument about commercial viability alone. I have to look at everything in totality. With regards to the Centec licenses, I think perhaps we need a conversation and a level of honesty on everyone's part. I think it will always be difficult for anyone who's being charged for a license, to be 100% happy with what they are being charged for, Even when you have to renew your motor vehicle license, if we said determine the price yourself, it will not be a price that is consistent with everyone else's interest. But there is space for the regulator, and the entity in that role for Centec to play a role. And at this very stage, I don't think that is the fundamental issue that causes a lot of this fight. I just think tactically, some of the broadcasters, see opportunities on different issues in order to push their self-interest, that are linked to either one, dominance in the space, their own dominance, and secondly, their own commercial viability.
Sticking with broadcasters and this discussion around dominance, a big issue has been MultiChoice's dominance in sports broadcasting and the lack of certain national games on open or free-to-view platforms. Specifically, the fight between OpenView and MultiChoice. The games actually do end up getting on SABC, but not on SABC's channels on OpenView because of this long-standing fight between DStv and eMedia. And so the question there becomes, because the ultimate argument is MultiChoice says eMedia is not paying its fair share. So should eMedia be paying for those broadcast rights, or should it be part and parcel of a deal with the SABC?
My key thing is that South Africans should be able to enjoy access to viewing sports. Then it becomes the mechanisms of doing that and the economics of ensuring that South Africans are able to view their sports, whether it's on MultiChoice, SABC, or it's on eMedia through their platforms. And I think the important thing in here is that, the business of sports broadcasting has become very, very lucrative. It's a very lucrative business, right? So it's always going to be contested. And there is someone who must pay for these services. My position is that there's got to be fairness that ensures that there's going to be access for South Africans to be able to watch this. The SABC, unlike the other broadcasters, has a public mandate. That public mandate means that there are people in a particular LSM who, unlike you and me, might not be able to afford being on these other platforms, that would want to watch the national team of the country playing a rugby match. I think the immediate opportunity that we have is on the listing of what are national sports events, so that we can look at making that list much more inclusive and also much more in tune with these current times, because even more sporting codes, they are evolving now. If you look at how the South African netball team, for instance, has performed over the last few years, their prestige and their standing both on the continent and in the world as a very, very competitive sports team means that it should be possible to be able to view more and more of their games. So I think that's ultimately where the contestation is going to be. So I think this way ICASA has a big role to play. And in my engagements with ICASA, I've been saying, look at the immediate spaces where there's opportunities to relook the model, relook at the current listing of national sports events, and let's see how we make those much more inclusive and also reflective of where South Africa is in 2024.
So part of the problem here seems to be that the SABC is obviously in financial distress. So there's been a lot of talk about how to fix the TV license problem. The broadcasters have their own views and have put proposals forward. But part of, I think, the disappointment from the last administration was the legislation that was ultimately tabled did nothing to actually address the TV license regime. It kicked it out a couple of years. And so what's your view on fixing the SABC's funding model? Is there a way to fix it, or must people just pay their TV license?
Look, I think there's several ways you can approach the question around the SABC's funding model. I think the TV license collection regime has failed, given the low uptake in terms of payment of licenses. I've got some wild ideas about how you could actually help improve that. I mean, and some of these things are already in the market in different ways. That, for instance, you can't renew your your driver's license if you still have outstanding. I think if you still you have outstanding fines, and
there must be an enforcement order of some
yeah,
sort.
there must be an
Yeah.
enforcement order. But also, like, you can't, if you've got multiple vehicles, for instance, you can't renew the one without settling the other, because those things are then, coordinated and integrated with e-natives. So there could be, and I mean, this is not a policy decision, so it mustn't come across like it's a policy announcement. But I'm saying that already in there's opportunities where you can interlink the TV license fee to other license fees that are there already, so that you can push up, the uptake of that. I think it's just an unfortunate that, that collection, the TV license collection regime has collapsed to the extent there is. I think we need, the SABC in this instance need to be far more creative. Broadcasting is evolving and it's highly competitive. And what gives, broadcasters the edge is the quality of their content, in addition to how stable they are being run and led. And I think, in fairness, with the incumbent board and CEO, at least at that level, you are seeing the restoration of good governance. You are seeing that the caliber of individuals there are also even in reinstalling the professional running of the SABC, and that stands in good fortune. But I think, there was a bill that was before the sixth administration that was also going to look at exploring ways of looking at the the SABC's funding model. But I think what is clear is that, given its current situation, the expectation, for instance, that it can rely on bailouts from the treasury in order to meet some of its pressing and immediate needs is not going to be realistic with the financial times of our country. And that is why the treasury and also the president in this instance has been very adamant on saying, where it is possible, explore public-private partnerships, so that these state-owned enterprises, be it the post office or the SABC, can be commercially viable to the extent that they are self-reliant.
While we're talking about getting the private sector involved, well, it's a tangent, let's be honest. Would the government consider selling its stake in Telkom?
Look, we'll have to have a conversation at cabinet level about it. You know that government is a shareholder. In fact, the presidency is the shareholder, and we are a nominee of the president on that. It's a conversation that cabinet would need to take a decision on. Yeah.
Okay. And on the subject of the post office, one of the controversial issues is around its claim that it actually owns a legal monopoly around the delivery of one kilogram or less small parcels. Is that true? And is that something that you would enforce?
Well, look, I think what we need to do when we think about the post office, at least for me, is that how do we create the space for the post office to be competitive in the postal and courier service industry that has become so digital, right? The biggest advantage that the post office has over any of its competitors in there is that it has the infrastructural depth that covers almost every remote area in the country. Tabo and I come from rural areas, right? One of the things that you're always assured of, whether it's in your village or the next village, is that there is now it's old post office infrastructure, but there was always a post office, whether it's within a 5 kilometer or a 7 kilometer radius. Juxtapose it with the fact that there's been the mushrooming of these courier service providers in the market. It shows that the market is there. Somehow, at some time, the post office got stuck too much in the presence and the world was moving into the future. And that future now means that it is stuck in the past. The whole debate about, the monopoly on the 1 kilogram, limitation for me is, it's a minor issue in the bigger scheme of the debate about the future and the viability of, the post office. I think legislation to that effect indicated that, or the interpretation of the legislation and the regulation is that it does own that monopoly, right? I think the biggest debate has been because of the operational deficiencies and the dysfunction and the instability over the years that have then made that even at that level, it hasn't been able to deliver as it should. And it is currently under business rescue, and it's a process that was initiated, that took place, and my predecessor has done a very good job in making sure that the business rescue practitioners focus on their mandate. Any business rescue intervention has to have, an end date so that the post office can continue, to survive on its own. But the biggest conversation about the future of the post office is we gotta relook the model of its ownership in its entirety. In this day and age, I can tell you for free, it is both not prudent and both not financially sustainable for the treasury, for the state to continue to be the sole owner of the post office. So we have to look at strategically opening it up for some private partnerships in that space, so that one, we leverage its infrastructure in order to be competitive and commercially viable in this sector.
Then this is getting back to telecommunications.
Yeah.
Another major issue has been the switch off of the 2G and 3G networks. And the deadlines that were being discussed was now in September and December. Are those still on the table? Not for I should clarify. The deadlines on the table are for September and December, but that's not for the switch off, but to stop the devices coming into the country.
That's not. I was going to correct that. That wasn't for the switch off. I think because we were in a meeting with ACT earlier this week, and the conversation was that initially it would be 2027. I think the conversation
the final
was that,
switch off. Yes,
as the final switch off. My key thing is, the thing about these deadlines and switch offs is they have to be informed by evidence-based decisions, right? Currently, the traffic, I don't have the figures, but because I come from a rural area, I know for a fact that in many rural parts of the country, because of two things, the affordability of 2G and 3G devices, and three, because of the connectivity issues, there are still millions of South Africans who are in possession of 2G and 3G devices in their hands. So any movement towards that deadline, for me, will be immediately will be risky while you still have that traffic of those devices. The conversation that we should be having, right, is in consideration of the fact that, yes, we need to evolve and move towards, 4G and 5G. How do we enhance universal access? You enhance universal access by tackling two things. One of them is making smart devices affordable. Smart devices in this day and age are not a luxury. They are not a luxury. They are a basic necessity. So one of my obsessions is looking at the declassification of smart devices as luxury items because they carry an additional tax. So we've already had informal, discussions with the Treasury about At the very least, we are not saying that remove, the associated taxes that make smart devices luxury goods, but have a threshold, right? Because whether it's for you, it's for work. For me, it might be for entertainment. For a young person in Zanin, where Thabo comes from, smart devices are used for learning, for work, for leisure, and for entrepreneurs. And we need to make sure that we create the policy space for those to be affordable, so that we remove the first primary barrier to entry and then deal with the quality of infrastructure investment on broadband, so that once you have a device, you can have connectivity, and that connectivity is reliable, and you can get almost the same quality of connectivity, whether you are here in your very beautiful offices, or you are in Diepsloot, or you are in KwaMashu in KZN. Yeah.
Minister, we have unfortunately run out of time, and there's so much more to talk about, but one last, just a quick fun thing. What broadband have you got at home?
I'm not promoting anyone. Thank you.
No, but is it fiber? Is it LTE? Is it...
No, it's fiber.
Is it fiber? How fast? 100 megs, 250 megs?
No, I think it's 125.
You got 125 megabits per second. Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Thank you very much for your time, Minister.